I want to welcome you to Contemporary Jewish Thought. And this afternoon, we will be speaking with Jacob Magid. I will introduce him in just a moment, sort of a deeper dive into the recent election in Israel and implications, and we'll try to understand this crazy electoral system and coalitions and thresholds and the characters at play. And Jacob and I will speak, we'll probably talk 30-40 minutes, and then we want to get to people's questions, or maybe if people are putting questions in the chat, from time to time, I'll take a look at the chat and we can address questions as we go. Everybody can hear me okay? Stevie, I'm just looking at you. Good, you can hear me? Okay. All right, so Jacob Magid, you are the Times of Israel U.S. correspondent covering developments in American politics as they relate to Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, and subsequently covered Israeli settlements as the West Bank correspondent. You are a really just a frequent contributor on the Times of Israel, who I read often, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the Park Avenue Synagogue community. I hope this is the first of many opportunities that we have to speak together. And by way of opening, I would love for you to just take a minute and tell us a little bit about you, the work that you do, how you got into what you're doing, and then we can jump into the election piece. So welcome, Jacob, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm quite impressed by the amount of people in the middle of the day that are able to come on and listen. So just a bit about me. I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, Skokie, for those who are familiar, and grew up in this area, then spent quite a couple of years in Israel after graduating high school, and also during college, where I went to the University of Maryland and studied Arabic and political science. Afterwards, kind of moved into journalism based off of just connections I had made in college in Washington, and quickly started with the Times of Israel, first as an editor and then as covering the settlements in the West Bank. For about 4 years, I lived out there, and about a year and a half ago was offered this new position as the U.S. correspondent. Moved back. I was actually in New York for about a year, and continue to cover what I do now. A lot of foreign policy focus, which is my main interest. And so that took place during the Abraham Accords, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and carrying into the Biden administration and its policies on Israel and the Palestinians. More recently relocated to Chicago, but continue to cover these issues on a day-to-day basis. And because of the time I was in Israel, I covered 4 elections. And because of that experience, I think that I was asked to come back and help with the coverage again last week. And I was on the ground for about a week and a half, help before and after the elections, following around Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the candidates on the Religious Zionism Party, and also going around to other cities around the country, getting a pulse of where people are thinking both before and after the election. So I'm looking forward to really speaking about that today.
Jacob, great. First of all, I'm a fellow alum of University of Maryland, just FYI. Exactly. So it's great to be in the presence of another Terp. So you sort of teed it up for us. You've covered 4 of the last elections. This was the 5th election, in the last how many years?
Less than 4.
Okay, so less than 4 years, we've had 5 elections. Can you kind of describe for us how we got to talk to us about the events leading up to this most recent election, and based on, you said you had the conversations you had on the ground all sort of figure into this. So sort of set the stage for us as Israel went to the polls.
So important thing to think about when talking about Israel is that the country is pretty split evenly down the middle, with about 50% of the country very much supporting longtime Prime Minister, Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu, and about 50% of the country that vehemently opposes Benjamin Netanyahu and will vote as much as they can to make sure that he doesn't return to power or doesn't stay in power. And that's basically been the what the elections have been about for the past 4 years, really just this one question. He's a really polarizing figure in society and well known not only in Israel, obviously, but even around the globe. He's a familiar face. And the elections have become an ultimatum about him. And the reason why we've had so many is because that although you could even figures point to about 51% of the public opposing Netanyahu and wanting him to go, that doesn't always play out with how people vote. And we can get to that in terms of what the results from last week. But sometimes there are parties that, like when we can look at last time with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who campaigned against or to maybe sit with Netanyahu, and then decided to join the bloc of parties that that made a coalition without Netanyahu. And this coalition lasted because the only thing they had in common was the fact that they don't like Netanyahu. There was no really ideological glue there. And because of that, it fell apart just about a year after it was formed in June, and sending the country into another election. And that's kind of the background to the most recent election, but it was a similar breakdown in the previous elections that we saw. Some of them, we didn't even have a government formed in between. There were 2 or 3 of them that were the case. One of them, we had a brief government that was a unity government led by Netanyahu and blue and white chairman Benny Gantz, who you might have known as the defense minister. And they had held a government that only lasted also around a year, or less so. And because of the differences between them, again, they didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and that fell apart quickly too. So there's been this real political instability for so long because that 50% of parties, either that doesn't like Netanyahu or the 50% of parties that do, haven't been able to really cobble together a large enough coalition to be sustainable in the long term. Now, for the first time, we have a different result, and we can get into why that was. But basically, I wouldn't expect another election, another cycle of election to continue. I think we're out of the deadlock as a result of because of the result that we saw on Tuesday.
Right. We'll get to those results, and Bibi's got a pretty solid coalition from what we can tell. So it's time for another election. We've got a lot of the same characters. Naftali Bennett's government falls. He sort of removes himself. You could probably make the case that some of the seeds for this outcome was when Bennett, entered into a coalition with. I know family members who felt betrayed by Bennett when he sort of turned his back on the right wing. So to help us leading up to the election, everything I was reading felt that there could be another deadlock, right? It wasn't clear. I think the prognosticators weren't out there saying Bibi's gonna, win with a solid 64, 65, seats. So what happened there? How does Bibi go from opposition to, essentially, as you said, it doesn't look like there will be another election anytime soon.
Right. So basically what happened was, again, we had the right-wing bloc of pro-Netanyahu religious parties. We're talking about Netanyahu's Likud, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties known as Shas and United Torah Judaism, and the Religious Zionism Party, which represents the national religious camp in Israel. Those 4 parties before the election basically amounted to about 52 seats, or maybe 53. And that's obviously less than the 60 or the 61 needed for a majority. But they're able to gain because they have basically the vast majority of Bennett's voters. Naftali Bennett had his Yamina party, which was another right-wing party, arguably maybe slightly to the left of some of those other parties mentioned. And that party had been about 7 seats in the past election. So right there, they have the 60-seat majority, but it's still not enough. They still need 61. And what happened was several factors. One, we saw a spike in turnout among right-wing voters. The general turnout in the country went up significantly, but specifically among right-wing voters, the national turnout was about 71%, as opposed to about 67 or 66% last time. and that bulk of that turnout came amongst right-wing parties. Not only did Likud voters turn up to vote, but ultra-Orthodox, Shas, and United Torah Judaism voters came out to the polls. And in addition, we saw religious Zionism take all the votes most of the votes, I would say, that Yamina had won in the previous election. Those may be what quote unquote soft right votes. And they brought new people to the polls, people that had not voted before, a lot of young people voting for the first time, a lot of people that just in the periphery towns that don't typically vote, that were really attracted by the messaging of Itamar Ben-Gvir's party. Some real hardline talk about the importance of personal security. I think real more militant talk against Palestinians and Arab Israelis. And that really, it catered to a lot of people that felt like their voices weren't being heard. Kind of some similarities between what's been happening in the US. I don't want to think that there's always easy to draw some comparisons, but so I want to be careful there. But again, so those two factors of a spike in turnout for those right-wing parties, and another thing was the disorganization of the parties that were running against Netanyahu. On the left, with a quote-unquote left-wing or left of center or anti-Netanyahu bloc, where we had two parties that did not cross the electoral threshold. And what that means is, in order to make it into the Knesset, you need to receive 3.25% of the national votes, and this is about 40,000 votes. Okay, and two parties, one known as Meretz, which is a stark left-wing party, and another known as Balad, which is a very nationalist Arab party. Both of them failed to cross the electoral threshold by a few thousand votes. And what happens when a party fails to cross the threshold is those votes are scattered amongst all of the other parties. So instead of those votes going solely to the left-wing bloc that is against Netanyahu, they go everywhere. And the left-wing blocks, instead of getting about 60 seats, which is what it would have gotten had those parties been counted as if they made the Knesset, it gets only 54 or 56, sorry, compared to Netanyahu's 64, that block. And we're really only talking about a discrepancy of about 30,000 votes between the two blocks. But because of this disorganization on the left, that the discrepancy is much larger.
So that's an important point, and I want to just my read on the numbers, as you said, is that even though Bibi walks with 64 seats, there really wasn't a lot of room between the number of votes received by the right-wing bloc versus the left-wing bloc, right? And that their share of the pie is more significant because these parties didn't get to the threshold. Is that correct? Right?
Exactly.
So I want to come back to you said something about young people voting for Ben-Gvir and for the religious Zionist party, who aren't necessarily in that community. But before I go there, just because we're throwing around a lot of terms, when we talk about, let's start on the right. When we talk about Likud, right? Likud is not a religious party per se, right? So we're talking. Can you just sort of give me a brief description of the four parties on the right? All right.
Right.
So
Sure.
people know the lay of the land here.
Sure, of course. Likud is kind of one of the founding not the founding party of the country. That's the Labor Party on the left. But Likud is one of the most historic parties. It's gone through different names, but it's been around for a while. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu's party. It's made up of generally, I would say the best way to describe it is traditional in terms of their religious observance. These aren't people that would identify as secular for the most part. And in fact, a lot of them, especially on the list itself, we're seeing a much larger presence of very traditional or even religious representatives in the Likud list. And that's kind of indicative of where the country is going more broadly, where the Jewish character of the state is kind of even above the democratic character in terms of importance in people's minds. So this is, again, not necessarily, though, a religious party, but increasingly talk of religion is common in the party. A lot of their support comes from periphery towns. I spent a lot of time in a few of them in the South, where people have been voting for Likud their entire lives and will continue to do so. And that's, again, just a kind of a main party, the main right-wing party in Israel. that takes across from all sorts of publics, religious, secular, some poor, some rich. Really, the biggest party won 32 seats, which is about a fourth of the entire Knesset, which is 120 seats. So that's the Likud.
And did Jacob just, I mean, from the last election, Likud was pretty consistent, right? Like, I mean, they're polling usually around that number of seats, so it's not as if they're right. Likud didn't expand, right? It's
right. Well, Likud didn't expand, but they did receive more voters because turnout went up.
right.
Again, so we're seeing people that maybe have voted in the past for Likud, but again, they succeeded in getting out the vote in comparison to in the previous several elections, where while they might have gotten a similar amount of seats, they weren't getting the kind of voting numbers that we saw last Tuesday.
Got it. So all right, so take us through the other three right-wing parties.
Sure. So then we have two ultra-Orthodox parties, one known as Shas, is headed by Aryeh Deri, and this is who's been around for one of the longest running politicians. And this is a party that represents the ultra-Orthodox communities that are Sephardic or Mizrahi background. And they performed quite well in this election, receiving 12 seats. They were managed to also get, they're obviously their voting base is ultra-Orthodox and from Sephardic backgrounds, but they managed to also, as they have in the past, in the 90s, this is when they were most successful, but they also managed to get support from constituencies that are not necessarily ultra-Orthodox, but more traditional, that where Judaism, they will say the Kiddush every Friday night and possibly keep Shabbat to different degrees, but they aren't ultra-Orthodox, but they are drawn to the campaign that Shas had it was very socioeconomic based and important of talking about the rising cost of living in Israel and the middle class, the importance of sustaining a middle class. And that's kind of what they spoke about in the campaign, and it apparently really drew to a lot of people because the party got 12 seats, building on, I think, when it had 9 seats in the previous election. So that's a really significant boom for them, and they'll likely be one of Netanyahu's coalition partners moving forward. The other ultra-Orthodox party is known as United Torah Judaism, and these are ultra-Orthodox voters who are Ashkenazi in background. Not too much more to say. I think beyond there is a note that the party itself and that public has moved a little bit to the right, and you can see that in the representatives and who they're willing to sit with. But again, it's I don't think they as much cater to populations beyond the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi population, as opposed to Shas, which does kind of try to reach to other communities. But they also did quite well and received about, I believe, 6 seats in the previous election. 6 or 7 seats in this election on Tuesday. The final party in this block is known as the Religious Zionism Party, and this is an alliance of several national religious parties, some more hardline than the others. One is Bezalel Smotrich's. You could say it's his national religious. It's the Religious Zionism Party because it's his party from the last time, but it's originally from his Tekuma faction, which is a party for, I'll say this word slowly, Chardalim, which is a combination of Haredi and Leumi. So these are Orthodox people who are nationalist, and they're more hardline than the typical national religious people that you might know that live in Givat Shmuel, if you've heard of that town, or Efrat. These are much more hardline people, often living in the settlements and like hardline settlements deep in the West Bank, or living in mixed Arab Jewish towns like Lod. So this is a very hardline population that Bezalel Smotrich represents, and he teamed up with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who runs the Otzma Yehudit party, and I think you might have heard a lot about this man, Itamar Ben-Gvir, over the past few months.
We're going to come back to him in a minute, so go on.
And this is someone they describe themselves as the disciples of the former, the late extremist Rabbi Meir Kahana, who was assassinated in the 90s, was very active in the Jewish Defense League that I think he helped establish in the US. Made Aliyah to Israel. His party was actually declared both a terrorist organization, both in the U.S. and in Israel, for inciting against Arab citizens. And this is Ben-Gvir's party is I think a moderated version is how he describes it of Kahana's Kach party. And Ben-Gvir has seen his popularity explode over the past year. And he was able to merge again with Smotrich for the second time, but this time have like an almost even split in the list, with 4 or 5 representatives now going to be entering the Knesset from Ben-Gvir's faction of religious Zionism, and then one more party called the Noam Party, which basically their platform is to be, they talk about the importance of family values. They're generally known as the anti-LGBT party. They're trying to push back against the expanded inclusion of LGBT individuals in society and the expanded rights for LGBT individuals. And that's basically their platform. And they have one representative that was in the last Knesset that remains with them again. His name is Abi Maoz, that sticks with them again. And this is, again, people from who voted. It's only a few thousand, but people from similar to Smotrich's party of Hardali, nationalist and Orthodox voters who are very hardline, but this is their main issue. And that's why they brought him into the Knesset again. So that's three parties. If I had to kind of split them up a little bit, Ben-Gvir's party, again, as I mentioned, relates to not only national religious voters who are hardline, but also non-national religious voters, as opposed to Smotrich's party, which is largely focused on getting support from nationalist religious people. So they are able to cater to slightly different communities, even though it's quite nuanced. And in the big picture, I wouldn't get too drawn down into the details.
Yeah. So you're describing these four parties that are part of the coalition, and within the religious Zionists, there are three parties that sort of join together in what appears, love them, hate them, almost like a master class from Bibi about how to cobble together and get these three parties who previously, were not together, to run together and put together a 14-seat block, which is pretty extraordinary in terms of numbers. So, all right, so here we are. We've got these, we've got the election set up. We've got the four winning parties. My question to you to help us understand is that in the past, Bibi has resisted these far right parties, right? When you look at the past governments from Netanyahu, oftentimes, he'll bring in people to the left of him who are more moderate, right? You had Ehud Barak on the left, you had Lieberman, on the right, Tzipi Livni on the left, you have Bennett on the right, right? He's got a whole interesting coalition. What leading up to this election, what happens that, that Bibi is really only courting these parties to the right of him, right? So, years ago, I don't know, a couple of years ago, he said something like, Ben-Gvir is not fit to sit in a coalition, or it might be exactly what he said, I might be paraphrasing. But before we do a deeper dive into Ben-Gvir, what's going on with Bibi that he's now created a coalition where he's actually the most liberal, right, of the group, right? What events transpired that led him to, right, to go that direction?
Sure. So this is the answer that you'll hear here is probably going to be politically tinted. So I'm going to try to answer as objectively as possible. But I will say that from an objectively speaking, first off, just like we have in the US, in Israel, there's been insane degrees of polarization over the past few years that has led the right to move further to the right and the left to also coalesce, maybe not to the left, but against the right in a lot of ways. Because as opposed to the US, everything in the Israel, or I guess less so now with Trump. So in the Israel, everything is around Netanyahu. So as the right is coalesced around Netanyahu, the left is coalesced around anti-Netanyahu. And why Netanyahu has found himself relying more on these parties that are willing to coalesce around him is that these parties have also campaigned on issues such as canceling Netanyahu, or passing legislation that would effectively cancel the criminal trial that is ongoing into former Prime Minister and incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the trial. He's on trial and indicted on 3 separate cases, on all 3 of them for fraud and breach of trust, and in one of them for bribery. I don't think I want to go too much into the details of these cases, but I will say that it's definitely a lot of the campaigns have been about over the past few years, and this cycle of elections have been about Netanyahu's trial, whether it should continue, whether it should be canceled, whether it's all a big conspiracy against Netanyahu by his opponents, and that's how Netanyahu very much frames it, and that's how his supporters do see the trial. And basically, we've seen all the parties that are against Netanyahu basically campaign on saying they can't sit in the government with someone who's under indictment. They see that as something that's unacceptable and will lead to a deterioration of Israel's democratic stature. And because of and with that trial, I think that as it's still going very slowly and it's not expected to finish in the next year or maybe even 2 or 3, but that's still impacting how the parties are coalescing around or away from Netanyahu.
So BBC's natural allies who would help him with this court case, right, to the right. Okay, yeah. That's what I'm reading, and that's what you're suggesting, right? All right. So, talk to us about Itamar Ben-Gvir. Right, this is a fascinating figure currently. You followed him around, you've covered him, you wrote an article. You can go to the Times of Israel website, everybody. First of all, it's a great website to follow and to get news from. And you wrote a op-ed that I'm looking at right now. It took 4 voting rounds to normalize Ben-Gvir. By the end of the 5th, he's a star. And if you're following this and you're watching, I'm just reading this piece about him down in Sderot, where it's like a rock star is coming to town. So talk to us a little bit about who this guy is, his ascendancy, and why are people who are not ideologically in sync with Ben-Gvir voting for him?
Right. Okay, so Itamar Ben-Gvir, in his I think he's about 46 years old. He grew up as a very far-right activist. He was involved in protests against the Oslo Accords in the 90s. And I think he gained national attention when he was interviewed after stealing the sign, I think it was a Mercedes sign, off of Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister at the time, in his car, and said, what are you going to... He boasted basically stealing the car. He said, this time we got to the car, next time we'll get to him.
Right.
And a few days later, Rabin was assassinated. Obviously not by Itamar Ben-Gvir himself, but another person in, I guess you could say, in a national religious camp. So Ben-Gvir was very much associated with the assassination and with the incitement levels in Israel that led to Rabin's assassination. He even afterwards tried to campaign to get the assassin Yigal Amir out of prison. And in previous election campaigns, I think he's changed his messaging, but in previous campaigns, he's talked about if he's elected, he'll try to get him he'll get him a pardon. That is the assassin, Rabin's assassin. So that's how he kind of went onto the stage. He was also arrested and indicted in 2007 for convicted of incitement to racism and support for a terrorist organization due to his support for Mayor Kahana. And holding signs at protests in support of Kahana and his calling for expelling Arabs. More recently, he's become a lawyer and has been a counsel for some very high-profile cases in Israel, representing far-right, often settlers who have committed alleged crimes against Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel proper, including one, I don't know if you might have heard of, in 2015, which was the firebombing of a home in Duma. A Palestinian village in which Palestinian parents and their infant were killed, and a toddler was severely burned. And he represented that case that's actually still ongoing to various degrees. It's in I think, a sentencing point at this point. But he's gained further prominence as this lawyer for far-right activists. And over the past few years has tried to run for Knesset, did not do so very successfully. And then in about 2020, in the second election of the 4 or the 5 that we've had, Netanyahu orchestrated a merger between Ben-Gvir's own Otzma Yehudit party, and at the time it was another national religious party that was running, and they didn't make it into Knesset, the party made it into Knesset, but Ben-Gvir was too low on the list to make it in. However, the next time he did make it in on that same list of parties that was orchestrated by Netanyahu. And he's moderated his message, and he says that he's moderated. It's arguable whether it's for show or if it's honest. He used to have, until 2020, a picture of Baruch Goldstein in his house that he proudly refused to take down. And this is someone who carried out the 1994 massacre in Hebron's Tomb of the Patriarchs, killing dozens of Palestinians worshippers. And this is someone, he had a picture of him, of the murderer, in his home. So he took it down in 2020. He says he doesn't have the same views as Mayor Kahana. He says he's moderated, as opposed to Kahana, who called for expelling all Arabs from Israel. He says he only calls for expelling disloyal Arabs from Israel, or terrorists, or those convicted of terrorism. So he said that's the nuance in terms of how he differs from Kahana. But in general, how he's catered to voters in the last couple elections, but specifically this one, is really talking about the importance of personal security. And he's able to hone in on the point that this is the first election that we've had since the May 2021 riots that we saw during the Gaza war. But that was also, these riots were taking place in mixed cities such as Lod and Akko and several other places across the country where both Jews and Arabs live together. And there was a lot of a high degree of violence between people, between the sides, with a lot of Jewish people then at the time and even since feeling that they're not safe in their own homes due to violence from Arab gangs or Arab citizens in the town. And Ben-Gvir really spoke to those people who want more personal security, to be able to send their kids to school without being concerned for their safety. And this was a main message of Ben-Gvir's campaign, talking about that. He also pushes for changing the rules, IDF's rules of engagement, to kind of shoot to kill in any sort of maybe suspected incident of violence involving Arabs or Palestinians. And those are basically his two main messages, but really the one of personal security is what seemed to really speak to a lot of Israelis who I think were interested in this all somewhat simplistic solution of how to deal with some of these problems, but I think are very frustrated and don't feel like they're being heard after the past several years as violence and crime is spiked in a lot of these towns, specifically in the periphery where Ben-Gvir really enjoyed a lot of support.
So Jacob, if I'm a 25-year-old post-army kid, not necessarily religious, but sort of, I mean, like a lot of Israelis, I like Shabbos, and I have Shabbos dinner, but I'm not like, I don't place myself in the religious Zionist community. Why am I voting for Ben-Gvir and not Likud? Right? What I mean is it? I mean, I know it's the load issue. It's farmers in the South, land being poached, right? But what is it that they're hearing in Ben-Gvir? Is it such a nationalistic message that they're being drawn to, that they're not hearing from Likud and Bibi, or are they fed up with Bibi? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah, I think you touched on it's some of the reasons I touched on. I think it's just a more blunt and honest, you could say, and to the point message. It doesn't try to make things at all hazy or complex. It's just, these are the problems, and we're going to make you safe. Very much blaming, I think, Arab citizens as a whole, whereas Netanyahu, for various reasons, didn't really talk about the issue of Arab Israelis as much in this campaign, as much as he did talk about specifically the Islamist Ram Party. But in general, his campaign strategy with the Arab Israeli vote was there's the word in Hebrew of lehardim et hashetach, I think, which means kind of put everyone to sleep. Because in the past, there was this strategy, I think we remember in 2015, where he was quoted on election day saying the Arabs were coming out in droves and we need to vote because the right wing needs to vote because the Arabs are coming in buses to the polls, and otherwise, if they continue doing so, we're going to lose power. And then in subsequent elections, he also talked about the danger of Arab Israeli terrorists in certain cases, and some message blasts that his party sent out. In this election, he very much didn't talk as much about this issue. He even tried to campaign a little bit in some of these Arab towns, reaching out and making some sort of campaign flyers in Arabic, which other parties, even on the left, didn't do. And again, the strategy was kind of show that there's no real difference between Netanyahu, who doesn't really talk about these issues or is actually willing to be amicable to Arab Israelis, and the left, which is also doesn't really talk about these issues as much either. So that was his strategy, whereas Ben-Gvir is talking about these issues head on and talking about the danger of Arab Israeli extremism and the need to address it head on. And that, I guess, appealed to a lot of young people. Even in Tel Aviv, he saw which is known as this secular left-wing bastion. Not a lot of religious people there, but he did enjoy several thousand votes. And he went to a high school in Tel Aviv, the Blich High School, for I think which they have like a mock debate every year. And he was greeted with like a thunderous applause, and people loved his responses to questions. I think there were some there that were really disgusted with his presence, but not everyone, especially young people. I think Israel is one of the few countries where young people actually tend to tilt right wing in their politics as opposed to more left wing. And that plays to Ben-Gvir's advantage when you're talking about the ability to give maybe more simplistic answers to very complex issues, because young people oftentimes, no offense, but don't have a more complex worldview, and are more susceptible, and also don't remember things that happened 10 years ago. I think there's a common talking point you'd even hear that before we left Gaza, Israel left Gaza in 2005, there weren't any rockets, and that now all the problems are since we left Gaza. That's a common point I'll hear a lot from young people that I met with in Sderot, who don't remember the fact that there were also rockets and terror attacks in Gaza and the surrounding areas before the disengagement. So again, people that are susceptible to very simplistic messaging that Ben-Gvir was offering, and that led to a real, also in addition to the real genuine alliance with and their frustration with the lack of personal safety that they've been feeling over the past couple of years. And that's what Ben-Gvir saw helped him get 14 points or 14 seats.
Yeah, and the poaching from the Haredim, there, I don't know how many votes, but that's a fascinating development to me.
Right, there was a fear that he was really going to be able to poach from ultra-Orthodox voters, and I think it did happen to a degree. Like when I was in Kiryat Malachi, which is a small periphery town in the south, I met with a bunch of young teenage ultra-Orthodox kids who were campaigning for Ben-Gvir, who said that their parents had always voted for Shas, and for the first time this election we're going to be switching over and voting for religious Zionism because of Ben-Gvir. They called it Ben-Gvir's party, even though Smotrich is the head of it. Ben-Gvir is just number two. And I think that did happen, but again, it wasn't like at the expense of the ultra-Orthodox parties. That was the concern that a lot of them had. These two ultra-Orthodox parties released campaign statements frantically saying, don't go to Ben-Gvir, he's going to get into Knesset anyway, stick with us, and we'll make sure your views are taken into account. And in the end, that campaign worked. All these parties, all four of them on the right, managed to keep their base and grow.
So let's talk for a couple minutes about governance, and then maybe we'll take a look at the questions and we'll wrap up. I was talking before about Bibi always having a more diverse, coalition and people around him. Just let's take one example, right? Bibi has resisted annexation in the West Bank, right? How do you see Bibi governing with this coalition to the right? Right. Can Bibi hold off some of these? He's, for all of his whatever issues people have, he's a pretty pragmatic guy when it comes to governance. When you look at and he's got a long record of what he's done or what he hasn't done, including the Abraham Accords. Right. How do you see him governing with this coalition to the right of him? Will he be able to? I know I'm asking you like you have a crystal ball and you don't, but will he be able to kind of keep this right wing in check and govern from the center on certain issues? Which, by the way, as I think there's a lot of agreement in the center in Israel on all kinds of issues, even between, the parties to the left of Bibi, right? What does that look like for him?
Right. So I think it's going to be quite challenging. I think he does have the luxury of having the Biden administration to use as that left-wing buffer, I guess you could say, that existed in previous coalitions. Now it's going to be an external kind of buffer. But again, yeah, these are all parties that support annexing the West Bank or large parts of the West Bank. I think Netanyahu, in the initial first few months to even a year, to even till 2024, I think will hold off on annexation. It's a promise that he basically made to the Trump administration at the time, and it was something the Trump administration itself signed off on when the Abraham Accords were signed, because the UAE refused to make a peace agreement with Israel without Israel foregoing annexation. But they didn't really, Netanyahu is not seen as amongst some Middle East leaders as someone who keeps to his word. So what the UAE did at the time was to have the Trump administration sign as like as a guarantee that they would not support supporting Israeli annexation until at least 2024. So that gives us, again, we have some time until I think this issue comes back into the forefront. However, the players in Israel are different, as you mentioned, and they're all people that support this, and they will likely push for it at some point. I think Netanyahu, with the excuse of saying, "Look, I have the Trump administration in Washington; they're down my throats about this. We can't be annexing the West Bank. We need Washington to be supportive with us on other issues. We get so much aid for them. We want them to listen to our opinion about Iran. Let's not push the boat on annexation, especially because I promised that we weren't going to do it for now." However, there are other issues in the West Bank that I don't think Netanyahu will be able to sustain pushback on demands from his right-wing partners, such as legalizing what's called their outposts. And these are little towns, sometimes just like hamlets, that were built illegally according to Israeli law in the West Bank. They do receive various degrees of government support, but on the official level, they're illegal. And there are about over 100 of them in the West Bank. And there's a lot of pressure. And I think even one Likud lawmaker said that one of the first things that they're planning on doing is trying to legalize these outposts that are located very deep in the Palestinian territory. And would likely make a two-state solution very, very difficult, which is something the Biden administration would likely push back on. Is this the first issue that they're going to get to? I don't think so, but it's at the top of the list, and I don't think it, like annexation or things that are more extreme, those might be pushed to the side, but things beyond that might not necessarily be the case. The major thing that they're probably starting with that I just want to touch on that has effects on everything moving forward is what's called a Supreme Court override law. And basically what the legislation would do is any law, any decision by the Supreme Court can be overturned by a majority in the Knesset. And this has been something that the right-wing parties have been pushing for a long time because they feel that the left wing, that the Supreme Court in Israel is a left-wing gatekeeper that's against the will of the majority, and they want to be able to rein in on the Supreme Court's independent powers. And this would, if they manage to pass it, and I think it will be very high on the agenda, will really impact any law that's passed from then on out, because then the Supreme Court will have no authority to override what the Knesset does, because what the Knesset will then go ahead and override that decision.
And that's not a BB cause. Is that coming from the far right, right?
Well, it's coming from within Likud, and a lot of people in Likud are also using it's needed for various things, including Netanyahu's longtime ally Aryeh Deri was convicted several months ago and barred from returning to his ministerial post for the time being. They need to pass a law that would basically allow him to come back, but that law would likely be struck down by the Supreme Court. So in order to pass that law to allow Deri to come back, they need to probably pass this override law at the get-go. So that's why it's so urgent for ultra-Orthodox parties, but it's also very much supported by Likud, who that's a lot of, for the more populist members, their main agenda has been the issue of the courts and trying to reform the justice system in Israel.
So you touched on a number of issues that really impact how North American Jewry is seeing this election, and there's a question in the chat about how this will play in North America. The fear that, I'm just looking at the question, social service charities like Federation, college campus, fueling college campus anti-Israel sentiments. Will, the end of the question is, will the new government even care how it's perceived in North America? So that's it's interesting, a question. And, just as a follow-up to that, like, what are you, you're probably hearing very similar things to what I'm hearing and other people, right? Whether it's Tom Friedman writing an op-ed that Israel we knew is gone, some of the panic that you're hearing from the American Jewish establishment. How are you perceiving this? And does do the do the Ben-Gvirs of the world even care what North American Jewry has to say?
Okay, so I think I'll take you back to 2015 when Netanyahu won the election then. And I think there was a similar feeling of panic among those that you're hearing today who said it's kind of the end of Israel as we know it. It's the most right-wing government ever, ultra-Orthodox and National Religious Coalition partners, the whole 9 yards. And I don't think the U.S.'s relationship was detrimentally harmed. I do think it went through some very difficult years as Netanyahu, when he went and spoke to Congress, and I thought, at least on that Capitol Hill level, I think we saw a major rift in the bipartisan nature of support for the U.S.'s relationship. But on the Israel diaspora level, I think this government really harmed in terms of the relationship, in terms of its walking back on what is known as the Kotel Agreement to formalize and build this egalitarian prayer space at the Kotel at the Western Wall. And there was an agreement that Netanyahu reneged on due to pressure from his ultra-Orthodox coalition partners. And I think it's taken time to heal some of those rifts, and the previous government was looking toward maybe some sort of solution on that issue. I don't think now with this new government we're going to see any sort of recognition of conservative reform or just non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, which we had been seeing under the previous government. So I think those strains are going to return. But I do think Netanyahu is very cognizant of the importance of U.S.'s relationship. I think he still does view it, I think, as something that he'd rather take his support from those who are willing to give it to him, meaning I think he's more willing to embrace the Republican Party and evangelical voters in America than he is willing to deal with people like J Street and others on the left who might identify as pro-Israel but are much more critical of the Israeli government's policies. So I think those relationships are going to see a real strain. Do I think it's will be irreparable? I don't think so. I think especially we're seeing the way that some of these mainstream Jewish organizations like the Federation, like the American Jewish Committee, that are careful not to be too critical of the new likely government that's going to be formed, while expressing some apprehension regarding Ben-Gvir and his views. I think at the end of the day, a lot of I think the establishment parts of the Jewish community in the U.S. Feels that the U.S.-Israel relationship is beyond politics and beyond the government of the day. But again, it's going to be a difficult, likely 3 or 4 years, I think, because the rhetoric is not the same. The values, I think, are not the same in terms of the importance of, very clearly in Israel, a preference of Israel's Jewish character over its democratic character, for good and for bad. Whereas in the U.S., I think there's still this hope that there will be a balance, at least among a lot of largely liberal American Jews.
But I don't know if you're going to agree with. I'm going to say something. I'm curious whether you agree. On the one hand, it's striking to see the split in the coalition, right, and the rise of the 14 seats for the Ben-Gvir, Smotrich. I'm blanking on the Noam Party's guy's name, but at a quick glance, it is possible to say we're looking at a very far right-wing country, right? But as I've sort of done a deeper dive into the analytics of the election and some of the numbers that you've presented, and the way coalitions are forming, the inability of Lapid to get some of these left-wing parties to join together. It's not so clear to me that, Israel has jumped off a cliff and, the Israel we knew, to quote Friedman, is gone. As much as it is, there were a lot of factors that led to the results that we see. And not necessarily that, Israel has gone, beyond the pale, and if that's how in terms of embracing far right-wing policies. I mean, is there some truth to that? Am I, is that spin on my part? Is it spin on others? Or, does the data tell us a slightly different story?
No, I think you're right. And that's I made that point up front about that we're only talking about a split between the blocks of of about 30,000 votes in Netanyahu, the pro-Netanyahu bloc's favor, which is less than one seat in the Knesset. And that's why, again, you're right. I don't think there's been this massive shift in Israel that happened overnight. However, it'll be hard to demonstrate that when this government is going to be ruling for the next 3-4 years and very, very much catering to the population. I think that it put them in power. And I think there's a high degree of stability in this government because they're all very homogenous and likely going to be able to govern accordingly. I think on the foreign policy level, Netanyahu will be careful and I think make a point of stressing Israel's democratic nature and importance to reaching to all communities and the importance of continued interactions with American Jews. But I think critics of Israel will be able to have a field day with this new government in terms of over what they disagree on, because I think it's going to be much more clear what those disagreements are.
So let me, thank you. There's just someone just posted the lead online story on Times of Israel is that there's been a request by the official conservative movement organizations, the RA, Rabbinical Assembly, asking Bibi to not make Ben-Gvir, et cetera, ministers for fear of fracturing all kinds of bonds and relationships. I think it's a sincere request that I can't imagine will be taken too seriously. So, all right. So look, we're going to wrap up in a minute, but there are clearly things to be concerned about, right, with this government and the coalition. I'm also curious from your perspective. So, and I think you've done a fair job of articulating some of the concerns about Ben-Gvir, et cetera, and what it means for Bibi to govern from the left in this situation. But let's try to end on a hopeful note here, right? What are the possibilities for good that you see with this government that will most likely be, as you said, in control for 3 or 4 years, right? Like a strong coalition. That doesn't feel like one person stepping out of the coalition is going to bring down the government. So what do we have to look forward to in the next 3 or 4 years in Israel?
Yeah, I would look toward the Abraham Accords again. I think that the countries that signed on to the Abraham Accords, now I will say that are very apprehensive about this new government. I do know, and I reported that when Netanyahu met with the foreign minister of the UAE a couple months ago, the foreign minister warned him that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich would be a real problem for them in terms of continued cooperation on the Abraham Accords. So I've watched that space. However, at the end of the day, I think these countries have an interest in maintaining their new relationship with Israel. And I still think there's the interest of countries who have yet to join the Abraham Accords still remains. And I do think it's more complicated. And I would watch what's happening in Jerusalem, specifically on the Temple Mount, and if there's any changes there to the status quo, as the Religious Zionism Party is pushing. I think that would further complicate those efforts. But if things stay in Jerusalem relatively calm, because I think that's really a bellwether for what happens in the Middle East, if that does happen, I would expect a strengthening of the Abraham Accords and possibly the expansion of the Abraham Accords. Even under this government, I think people across the region are seeing that it's a win-win, regardless of who's in power in Israel. And they made this deal with Netanyahu in the first place, and they'll be willing to continue working with him moving forward, is what I would expect.
Yeah. You tagged something that we're going to have to come back to in our next. I mean, obviously, this Temple Mount situation is, like a huge issue, and the Ben-Gvirs want full access to the Temple Mount, and as you said, that could be a real deal breaker for some of these Arab countries. So we'll see how that plays out. Jacob, I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure. Wonderful to meet you. That's like they say on the radio shows, long time reader, first time caller, so really thank you for your time and your insights. I hope that we have opportunities in the future as this continues to unfold to be in dialogue and to get your perspective in person. Everyone can go on the Times of Israel and just read some of Jacob's articles and analysis. And again, Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Jacob, thank you for your time, and we'll see you soon. All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right.